Hello, horror stories. When I worked as a taxi driver, I experienced countless strange events, but believe me, this is the worst of all, and it still gives me chills when I remember it. Never in all my years of work did I imagine facing such a terrifying paranormal event. My name is Richard. It all started one afternoon when there were a few hours left before the end of my shift. I was driving through San Luis and exiting Highway 64. At that moment, a passenger signaled for me to stop and get into the taxi. She was a woman of almost 70 years old, but there was something about her that made me uncomfortable, perhaps her energy or her defiant look. With his presence, I felt the taxi fill with a heavy, dark vibration. But I didn't give it much importance, and I asked him where he was going, and he said he was going to the city center, about 20 minutes away. I took her there and continued with my route since I still had a couple of hours of work left. It was getting dark when a few blocks after leaving that woman, I began to hear a baby crying from the back seat. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I immediately turned to look under the back seats and saw a cardboard box wrapped in a blanket. At that moment, I thought the worst and felt terrified. That's where the crying came from, and to make matters worse, I almost crashed the taxi from fear. I couldn't grab the box while driving, so I continued a few more blocks and found a safe place to stop. At that moment, I no longer heard the crying. I quickly left, and when I grabbed the box, I noticed that it was much lighter than a baby's weight. I felt great relief until I opened it and automatically threw it on the floor. Inside was a dead rat with no eyes. I was shocked. Just a few minutes ago, I had clearly heard the cry of a baby coming from there. Everything became very confusing and macabre at that moment. I couldn't find an explanation, but I was sure of one thing. That box belonged to the woman. Before I got in, I had been dusting the back seats as a young man had been eating biscuits and made a mess. So I started cleaning it up, and there was nothing under the seat. Until that day, I didn't understand what had happened. Why that woman had left the box in my taxi, or where the baby's cries had come from. 3 days later, when I went out again with my taxi, I still didn't have answers. My head was spinning. I had taken those days off to rest because I felt very unwell in my body. I remember having a fever and being in bed, unable to move like I had never experienced before. That afternoon, when I got back into the taxi, everything felt different. There was a heavy vibe that deeply unsettled me, and an indescribable smell, despite having thoroughly cleaned the car after that night. But that was just the beginning of a nightmare. That same night, an old man got into my taxi with his grandson, who was about 4 years old. The child was calm until he got into the car, at which point he started screaming and crying inconsolably. He clung to his grandfather in fear and wanted to get out of the car. The grandfather apologized, saying that the child didn't normally behave like that, and he didn't understand what was happening to him. I told him not to worry, but I was puzzled to see how the child screamed and refused to sit down, pointing under the seats and lifting his little legs in fear as he kicked. We drove a few blocks, but the child didn't calm down. His crying was so intense that the grandfather asked me to stop, and they finally got off, even though we still had a long way to go to reach the place he had indicated. I told him not to worry, that I would take him there, but he insisted that he preferred to get off and thanked me anyway. I drove for a while longer, until I felt as if something touched my neck, sending shivers down my spine. I turned abruptly, but there was no one there. The taxi was empty. I tried to calm down, telling myself that it was just the result of tiredness and stress from the past few days. However, the atmosphere inside the taxi remained unsettling. I decided to open the windows to let in fresh air and relieve the oppressive feeling. As I drove, I began to hear again that baby's cry, which seemed to come from the back seats. I looked in the rearview mirror, and that's when I saw a very dark shadow moving. I made a somewhat abrupt maneuver and stopped to calm down and take a look around. At that moment, a lady approached asking if I could take her. I said yes, I honestly needed to distract myself and continue with my work. I had checked the interior of the car, and there was nothing out of the ordinary in sight. So she got in and told me where to go. She was a very pleasant woman, and we were chatting normally until suddenly, she interrupted and said, "Son, there is a very dark presence in this car. I can feel it. The air is very heavy." I remained silent for a few seconds and then asked her what she meant. She explained that she was a very spiritual person and that she was in the city because she had attended a spiritual retreat for a few days. She told me she was very sensitive to energies and that there was something evil in my taxi that was after me. Although she didn't want to scare me, she warned me that I should get rid of the car as soon as possible and seek a blessing for my safety. The woman's warning left me deeply unsettled. I tried to stay calm and continue the conversation, but my thoughts were completely focused on what she had just told me. When we arrived at her destination, the lady thanked me and got out of the taxi. Before leaving, she showed me her hair standing on end and insisted that I listen to her, warning that otherwise it could end in tragedy. This time, almost as a command, she repeated her advice to get rid of the car and seek a blessing. I dropped her off at her hotel and thanked her for everything she had told me. Her face showed concern for me, and before leaving she said, "Take care, son." After that trip, I wanted to go back home. I didn't feel like continuing to work. I knew something was wrong. When I arrived home, I called my mother and told her everything that had happened. Without hesitation, she contacted a priest known for his ability to cleanse negative energies and deal with spiritual entities. The next day, the priest inspected the taxi, and his expression became serious. He explained that what was in the car was not just negative energy, but an evil spirit drawn by some dark event or a person with a very disturbing energy. He said that removing such an entity would require a much more complex ritual. He prepared the place with candles, incense, and various ritual objects. As he recited words in an ancient language, I felt a pressure in my chest, and the air became dense. Suddenly, a gust of wind swept through the interior of the taxi, extinguishing the candles and plunging the car into overwhelming darkness. Suddenly, the baby's cry began to resonate more intensely. The sound was so terrifying and horrifying that I recoiled, but I watched as a shadow materialized in the back seat before vanishing with a final desperate scream. The priest advised me to get rid of the taxi. He said that the presence inside was extremely strong and devilish, and there wasn't much more he could do about it. He warned that this presence could follow me everywhere and never disappear. I panicked. The priest blessed me and said goodbye. That same afternoon, I took the car to a dismantler and sold the parts separately. It was my livelihood, but I had no alternative. A few days later, I got a message from my ex-girlfriend on my phone saying, "Even if you get rid of the car, the darkness will haunt you forever." When I read it, it all made sense. I realized that she had cast a spell on me and had sent that woman with the rat wrapped in a blanket inside the box to leave it in my taxi. I couldn't believe the cruelty of my ex-girlfriend, wishing me harm to the point of killing me. After reading that message, anxiety consumed me completely. I couldn't sleep for days. Every time I closed my eyes, images of that terrifying night returned to my mind, along with the feeling that something dark and evil was lurking. Every night I fell into a state of terrifying wakefulness, unable to fall asleep for fear of what might happen if I closed my eyes. It still disturbs me to this day. If you have enjoyed this story, we invite you to subscribe and activate the bell so you don't miss any others. Until next time.